Hello, I'm Alan Capper, South News. The economic decline of major corporations and countries during the last 3 or 4 years has been notable with long-lasting impact. We have with us today a writer who has written on the background to this in the form of a novel, but he's written this with enormous insight into global financial markets and the banking world. We're very glad to have with us Mr. H T Narea, who has just published his novel called The Fund.
Thank you for having me here, Alan.
We're very glad to have you here. Now, in the book, you're a little bit like a poacher-turned-gamekeeper, it seems, because you're not wholly attributing the financial problems to banks, are you? What you're really saying is that there is some inevitability in this, but there are more dark forces at work.
Absolutely. I think the original impetus for the book with me started in that I looked around and I think we could all recognize this happening in the market. Over the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, you could see what would be deemed to be legitimate players in the market going about their business, making profits, and taking strategies of dark pools of capital that are very unregulated with instruments that are maybe people hope would be better regulated than they are, which are derivatives, for example, creating strategies to make money, which is allowed, and that's the good old capitalistic mode. Mm-hmm. However, in that process, they impacted many financial institutions, some targeted and some bringing them down at the end of the day, the likes of Lehman and others that were affected by a lot of the things that occurred in terms of the lack of liquidity in the market. And so I looked at that and said, okay, that's happening on a legitimate basis of people making profits. What if someone had more surreptitious motives, maybe political motives, maybe even terroristic motives, and said, I shall take the same path, but I have a different objective. I have political motives. And so that became the premise of my novel, is basically saying, is there an opportunity here, given the laxness of our financial market regulatory environment, to have something that I call financial terrorism? And that became the storyline.
Right. So in the book, The Fund, you're accepting that there were global economic and financial problems, particularly with the banks, but there is something more. And do you believe this to be a fact, or is it fiction?
I could answer it many ways, and I will answer it this way. About a month ago, my editor at Macmillan sent me an email of an article that appeared in a Washington paper. The article was ostensibly about something called economic warfare. I read it was interesting, and it highlighted some aspects that seemed to relate to my book, but I wasn't sure. So I got it. It was basically about a report that had been commissioned by the U.S. Department of Defense. It was titled that, Economic Warfare. I got a hold of that report through my contacts in Washington. I read it. It was about a 150-page tome of a lot of very detailed economic jargon, not a novel at all. It was actually someone doing a very non-fictional analysis of things and making some conclusions. And I read it, and I started highlighting through the report things that related to my book. I ended up highlighting about, 90% of the headings of that report. And what that report essentially dealt with was suggesting that there were such avenues during the last financial crisis that related to something that was not just a surreptitious, chance encounter of many things that were happening in the market, but rather there were some purposeful motives and things that were done by agents yet to be discovered that brought down several institutions and that created the avenue. So I read that report. I got a hold of the guy that wrote it for the Defense Department. Had a nice lunch with him, a nice long lunch in Washington. I had shared with him my book. He equally, reading my book, was astounded at the similarities. He agreed about that 90% quotient. He in fact told me, says, when I was doing the research for this report, it occurred to me that some aspects of it would make a good novel. And I said, well, there you go. That's my book, The Fund. So he laughed about that. We ended up discovering basically that his real life analysis and my novel had that parallel. We had a discussion, a panel that Georgetown University hosted in Washington about it. The audience was filled with people that were people from the intelligence community, government regulators in the financial community, and academics. And not a single person in that room stood up and said, this is impossible. Rather, their whole questioning and discussion was based on the details of it, the mechanics of it, and how it occurred. So that to answer your question, there are people that believe that there are aspects of our economy right now that expose us to potential threats.
Right.
One can argue till the cows come home whether it happened in 2008 or not, but what I can say with certainty is that the lackness of environment that we have today does create the avenues in this economy, in the US economy, for people to come in and do odd things. And we see that every day. Someone again today was arrested for insider trading. It just keeps happening. It's because it's very simple. When humans are put in front of money and power, it becomes combustible.
Right.
So we think we have Madoff as a new thing. Well, there was a Ponzi before then. There'll be other Ponzi's afterwards. It will continuously happen. So the way our economy is set up is a question where people have to decide whether they want too much regulation or an environment where there's not enough regulations. I believe somewhere in the middle you have to strike a balance.
But is that the answer? More regulation? We thought we had regulations.
Yeah, but I think that's a good point, Alan. But the problem is, I think, as a practitioner in the market, I know even people who are in the market do not understand fully the instruments they're getting into.
Right.
They think it's a panacea. Derivatives is one of those instruments where people forget about risk.
Explain derivatives, because I'm sure there are a lot of people, a lot of our viewers that don't really comprehend.
And there's people in the market that tend to play off on that, okay, by having something that's a little bit arcane that regulators can't even understand. I mean, This is definitely the case of what occurred. People could not understand them. My objective in writing a novel was to make the story of something like derivatives more broadly understood. And so the trick that I had to do was make sure that I could take something that's so sophisticated as an instrument and explain it down and water it down. And so the way I most find myself better explaining it to people is if you take a classical approach of what a derivative was originally intended to do. Think of a farmer who is going to start his crop. He's going to till the land. He's going to put in fertilizers. He's going to seed it with, let's say, wheat. Then he's got to wait his time and make sure that the wheat is developing correctly. So let's call it, a 3 or 4 or 5 months harvest time. Well, at the moment that farmer has planted his seeds, has started spending money, spending his working capital, he's out that money. Now, he's a good farmer. He knows what the soil is, what the climate is, and all the things that he needs to fertilize. He knows that's what he does for a living, so he knows it well, as could be understood. The one thing he's exposed to is price, which he has no control over, because that's a world commodity price for wheat. And so he doesn't know 4 months down the line if he's going to be paid for his investment of working capital. And so the way to ensure against losing money for that farmer is to say, I'm going to put in a forward price and agree to that forward price, and that way I've locked in my profit for this season, but I'm not exposing myself to any risk of not making the money back. Now, where's the problem? There's no problem in that, and that's a good thing. The problem is that derivatives, by the count of the Bank for International Settlements, are approximately, at last count, which was end of 2009, about $582 trillion. $582 trillion is equivalent to 10 times the value of global GDP. So that means that someone is taking that one farmer's crop and that exposure that he's created in terms of that derivative and betting on it 10 times over.
Right.
And that's the problem. It becomes a global casino. You don't know anymore who's holding this risk, who's the counterparty, what if that crop goes wrong? It's not just affecting that one farmer, it's affecting the 10 other counterparties that have created a trade around that one event, that one real event. And it's this fictitious stuff that floats around that becomes this global casino-like fashion that becomes a problem, that creates the danger, and that's where regulators want to come in. It says, we need to know who holds these. We need to know, what's the pricing, what's the collateral against them in case they go wrong, so we don't have another AIG tumbling down. Right. All of these are all the issues that literally, as we speak, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, other finance ministers around the world are dealing with. Literally, right now, it is being discussed on the Hill, this issue.
When Lehman Brothers went down, then it was rather like looking at dominoes, wasn't it, after that? And we all thought, well, that's the inevitable result of the mortgage market and all of the bad errors of judgment. Well, you're suggesting, though, that on top of that, on top of genuine problems with the global economy, there were other forces at work, which is fascinating. But we don't know that for sure. But let me ask you this. If we're postulating, who would be our enemies? Who would want to do that? We know the US has a growing number of opponents out there.
There are a lot of people who have unfriended us on Facebook. Let's put it that
Yeah,
way.
indeed,
yes, for sure.
indeed. But I mean, who hates capitalism so much now, when so much of the world is living with a capitalist system, that they would want to really upset, if not destroy, the world economic system?
Well, I think that question deserves a Merlot, because that's a really very broad question of discussion. But it's, the world of geopolitics, and I'm a student from Georgetown University. We studied international relations there, and I actually teach there as well, finance. And so that question is very imbued with what is happening in the world today. What is the role of the United States? Is it a unilateral power structure that we have around the globe? Is it the responsibility of the United States to go into each country where they see a hotbed of something occurring, to go and put it out there? The problem is that the United States does not, it is now being shown, it does not have unlimited capacity, wealth, to be able to be in every hotspot around the world and control it. And I think Americans themselves are beginning to understand that as well. And it is a discussion in terms of having problems that occur in one place or another, if we can be there in all the places at the same time. Right. That's number one. The fact that we've tried to be there in many cases creates the unfortunate opportunity that others in that country, whatever factions may be, do not like us, do not like Americans, and do not like US policy. And so it is possible in certain select markets where people may have access to money to be able to sit down and say, let's be more sophisticated about our approach here. We're not going to have purely kinetic events that can occur and they can hurt and damage people in whatever, even in locations like New York. But rather, let's have something that is more far-reaching and have something that affects the U.S. ability to continue to be this global policeman, and that is our economy. Mm-hmm. If we have no money, we don't have the ability to be everywhere. No, so you can start thinking of a whole variety of countries around the world. Some of them are not in any way overtly antagonistic towards us. However, it is in their interest maybe not to have the United States sitting on every shore.
No, I can see that,
right.
and that's a very significant point. But now looking at the global economy, what has this done to the developing nations? And are you still optimistic that they can keep becoming developing nations? China and India, we know we're looking at two enormous 50-pound gorillas in global terms. Right. But what about the countries in Africa and in Asia that are struggling to develop? Right. What do you see for them?
I think it's I come from a developing country. I was born in Chile and I grew up there, and I grew up in other developing countries as well. And so it's an issue that I take very much to heart and have an empathy for and understand what the goals of people in those countries are. And it is something that I'm glad to see something like South News to be able to expose some of the issues that drive those markets, as opposed to just seeing what happens across the North Atlantic corridor. I think that we are entering a phase where I think many countries around the world are realizing that the traditional dialogue that occurs in the North-North side and the formulas that come out of that dialogue are not always applicable in every country. I mean, right now, as we speak, we have another issue that's a North-South discussion point, is who is going to be the head of the IMF. And as we know, there's obviously a play of Europe wanting to continue in that role, in particular France to continue in that role, as opposed to maybe other entrants into that discussion flow. I think it seems like inevitable, regardless of who becomes, if it does become the French finance minister in this instance, probably seems very likely that the next subsequent one will be from a country other than a European country. Right. It sort of started a trend that's inevitable. And those are the kind of things I think that we're seeing around the world, that the discussion is now is more balanced in terms between the developed world and the developing world, and that there will be a shift. And it's hard to see it being stopped, simply because of the way, literally the fact that you are here, that you are transmitting news that is not traditionally seen in North-North kind of dialogue. It is expanding the discussion to places that before didn't hear that kind of discussion. And so communication, the internet, is allowing for that discussion to be opened up. Before it wasn't. Right. It was a very closed universe of people and had a very simple perspective in terms of what the world, you can see it on Twitter, for example. I'm constantly on Twitter because I see the simultaneousness of news that's occurring in a variety of places, and I see angles that I just don't see by sitting in Manhattan. I wouldn't see this news, and now all of a sudden I have an incredible ability to see things happening in other parts of the world that 5 years ago I wouldn't have had. I just wouldn't
Which
have.
again is why the United Nations Millennium Development Goals are still very significant for developing countries and for countries in the north that are investing, funding, being patrons. But I don't think developing nations are looking for patronage. They're looking for investment, support,
partners.
to be bought into partnership with the...
But you know what? You see countries, obviously we all know about China and India.
Right.
But there are other countries out there, Brazil, Chile even, as a small country. There is an incredible entrepreneurial spirit in these countries. And if you have ever been in the airport in Sao Paulo, going from Sao Paulo to Rio, you know this country is going somewhere, because all you hear is people talking and doing deals. There's an incredible energy in that country for development. I mean, and you can see where that country's headed. It's really got a preeminence that's quite impressive. It's fulfilling finally the promise that it's always been heralded to have. And it's happened because finally people in that country have taken ownership of their finances, of their development, and trying to fund social development of their people. And I think that is what's going to take us all out of the potential problems that we've been having, and develop frankly a more peaceful world at the end of the day.
Well, that is what we fervently wish for. Are you going to write a sequel to this book?
I am already doing so. I'm already doing so.
And is there going to be a movie?
Actually, I have a very good friend of mine who is the former chairman of Sony Pictures. He read this book in an earlier edition, and he came back and immediately said to me, it's very cinematic and I'd like to try to sell it in Hollywood. So that's what he's doing right now. I picture the protagonist and Angelina Jolie, and that's what most people tend to agree. So
Great casting. But I want to read this just to close our discussion, because this is one explanation why it's being looked at as a movie, because the reviews have been fantastic, and many of them from very illustrious other novelists, which is good. But this one I think was particularly relevant. It says, for readers who like inside stuff, which is what you've given the novel, The Fund Will Be Heaven on Earth. It's an incredibly knowing exploration of politics and money in places like Caracas and Havana that no reporter knows enough about to write a line. And it all swirls back to Washington, D.C. with page-turning suspense.
Well, that's very, I hadn't read that one. So
well, you can't ask for better reviews than that. So, H T Narea, it's been a great pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Good luck with the book, The Fund. It seems to be going well.
If any of your viewers want to get in touch with me, they can just go to my website, www.htnarea.com, Narea.com, and they can just send me a little email there. Excellent.
Many thanks. Alan Kappa, South News.